What happens when a man known for quiet intensity, measured words, and old-school restraint is placed across the table from a voice that thrives on provocation, interruption, and unapologetic opinion? What happens when politeness becomes a weapon, and patience becomes a line that, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed? Before we go any further, make sure you subscribe to Stage View, hit like, and drop a comment if you're ready for celebrity moments that don't just entertain, but explode. The lights of the View studio glowed with their usual morning cheer, a brightness so practiced it felt almost artificial. Applause rolled in waves as the camera swept across the audience, women clutching coffee cups, men leaning forward with curiosity. On the surface, it was just another weekday episode. Another celebrity guest. Another polite conversation. But beneath the polished table and pastel mugs, something else was brewing. Jude Law sat tall but relaxed in his chair, ankles crossed, hands folded loosely in his lap. His suit was classic, dark, tailored, unshowy. He wore the expression of a man who had spent decades learning how to exist in rooms like this without giving too much of himself away. There was a gentle smile on his face, the kind that suggested openness while guarding the interior. He had done this before. Hundreds of times. Joy Behar sat opposite him, angled slightly forward, chin lifted, eyes sharp behind her glasses. She wasn't smiling, not fully. Joy never wasted energy on unnecessary warmth. Her role at the table was different. She was the questioner, the skeptic, the one who poked and prodded until something interesting spilled out. The introductions passed smoothly. Laughter floated easily as Jude joked about his latest film, about accents he could never quite shake, about the strange experience of watching his children grow up faster than his career ever had. The audience loved him for it. They always did. Joy leaned in. "So, Jude," she said, her voice casual but edged with intent. "You've been very vocal lately about privacy, about fame being intrusive. But isn't that a bit rich, coming from someone who built a career on being seen?" The room shifted. Jude blinked once. Slowly. "Well," he replied, calm as still water, "I don't think wanting privacy negates the work. Acting is what I do. Being dissected as a person isn't part of the job description." Joy tilted her head. "But isn't it, though? I mean, fans feel like they know you. You profit from that closeness." A few murmurs rippled through the audience. Whoopi Goldberg glanced sideways, sensing the change in temperature. Sunny Hostin straightened slightly in her chair. Jude smiled again, but this time, it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I think," he said carefully, "there's a difference between connection and entitlement." Joy let out a short laugh. "That sounds like something publicists say when celebrities don't like the questions." The audience reacted audibly now, a mix of laughter and discomfort. Jude inhaled, slow and measured. Inside, something tightened. He had answered tougher questions. Far tougher. But there was something about the framing here. Something that felt less curious and more accusatory. "I'm happy to answer questions," Jude said, his voice still even. "I'm less interested in being told what my intentions are." Joy raised an eyebrow. "I'm not telling. I'm asking." Jude met her gaze directly for the first time. "And I'm answering," he said. Politely. That word hung in the air. The applause that followed was hesitant, uncertain. The audience could feel it now, the shift from light banter to something more electric. This wasn't going to be one of those forgettable interviews. This was turning into a moment. Joy crossed her arms slightly. "You've spoken about Hollywood changing. About masculinity. About what men are allowed to be now. Some people think that sounds like nostalgia for a time that wasn't so great for everyone." There it was. Jude nodded slowly, as if he'd expected this. "I think reflecting on complexity is healthy," he said. "I don't believe acknowledging nuance means endorsing harm." "But you don't deny," Joy pressed, "that men like you benefited from systems that excluded others?" A hush fell over the studio. Jude paused. Longer this time. He could feel the cameras pushing closer, the producer's eyes glued to the monitors. This was no longer just conversation. It was positioning. "I don't deny history," he said finally. "But I reject the idea that self-awareness requires self-flagellation." A collective ooh rippled through the crowd. Joy smiled thinly. "That's a very elegant way of saying, 'Not my problem.'" The smile left Jude's face. "No," he said, still calm but firmer now. "It's a very honest way of saying I take responsibility for my actions, not for assumptions placed upon me." Whoopi cleared her throat. "All right, let's." Joy waved her off. "No, I want to stay here for a second." Jude's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You've spoken," Joy continued, about being tired of cancel culture. But isn't accountability just consequences? Jude leaned forward slightly now, hands resting on the table. Accountability, he said, requires fairness. Consequences without context are punishment, not progress. The applause was louder this time. Stronger. Joy opened her mouth, then closed it. For a split second, something flashed across her face. Surprise, maybe. Or irritation. Well, she said, adjusting her glasses. That sounds nice in theory. Jude held her gaze. So does respect, he replied. The room went still. Even the applause seemed to hesitate, as if unsure whether it was allowed to erupt. And somewhere off camera, a producer mouthed the words, "This is getting good." The tension had arrived. And Jude Law, still perfectly polite, had just drawn a line. The applause that followed Jude's last words didn't come all at once. It arrived in fragments. First a few claps from the front row, then a swelling wave as the audience realized they were witnessing something unscripted, something raw. The kind of moment daytime television pretends never happens anymore. Joy Behar waited for the sound to die down. She didn't rush. She had been doing this too long to be rattled by applause. When she spoke again, her voice was lighter, almost playful, but the edge was still there, sharpened now by challenge. "Well," she said, leaning back slightly, "you certainly know how to phrase things beautifully." Jude inclined his head, a restrained acknowledgement. "I try to speak plainly," he replied. "Beauty is subjective." A few laughs broke the tension, but they didn't dissolve it. Not really. The air still felt tight, stretched thin like a wire pulled too far. Joy tapped her fingers on the table. "Let me ask you this, then. You've said actors should be allowed to stay apolitical. But isn't silence also a political choice?" The audience leaned in as one body. Even the camera movement slowed, settling into tighter shots. This was no longer casual morning TV. This was a duel wrapped in courtesy. Jude exhaled through his nose, thoughtful. Inside, he felt the familiar pressure. The sense that any answer would be clipped, reframed, replayed endlessly online. He'd walked into the studio prepared to talk about a film. He hadn't expected to defend his moral architecture. "I don't think silence is always silence," he said carefully. "Sometimes it's listening. Sometimes it's choosing not to simplify complex issues into slogans." Joy nodded slowly, then pounced. "But people with platforms like yours don't get the luxury of neutrality. That's what critics say." Jude's lips pressed together briefly. When he spoke again, there was a subtle shift, his voice still calm, but more grounded, more resolute. "I don't accept that visibility equals obligation to perform virtue on demand," he said. "I believe in action over announcement." A murmur rolled through the crowd. Someone clapped. Someone else gasped. Sunny Hostin leaned forward. "But don't you think," she interjected gently, "that public statements can inspire action?" Jude turned to her, grateful for the change in tone. "Absolutely," he said. "When they're sincere. When they're informed. When they're not coerced." Joy jumped back in immediately. "So when celebrities speak out because they're expected to, you see that as fake?" "I see it as pressured," Jude replied. "And pressure rarely produces truth." Joy's eyes narrowed slightly. "That sounds like an excuse to stay comfortable." The word landed hard. Comfortable. The audience reacted instantly, an audible intake of breath, a few disapproving murmurs. Jude felt it too, the subtle sting beneath the politeness. He straightened in his chair. "With respect," he said, and the phrase was not decorative now. "You don't know my comfort. Or lack of it." Joy raised her hands. "I'm not attacking you personally." "It feels personal," Jude replied quietly. Silence. Whoopi shifted in her seat, clearly weighing whether to intervene. The producer's voice crackled faintly in an earpiece somewhere off stage. Joy smiled again, but it was tighter this time. "You're an actor," she said. "You deal in feelings. Surely you can understand why people expect empathy." Jude nodded. "Empathy doesn't require performance." The applause was louder now, more confident. The audience was choosing. Joy let the sound wash over her, then leaned forward again. "Okay, let's talk about masculinity. You've said modern conversations sometimes feel accusatory. Why is that threatening?" Jude's brow furrowed slightly. "I didn't say threatening. I said unproductive." "But why?" Joy pressed. "If the conversation makes you uncomfortable, maybe that's the point." Jude considered her for a moment. Not as a host, not as an adversary, but as a person across a table. "Discomfort can be useful," he said. "Hostility less so. When dialogue starts from blame, people stop listening." Joy scoffed lightly. Sounds like men asking to be handled gently. A ripple of laughter, nervous, divided, moved through the studio. Jude's expression hardened just a fraction. Sounds like someone deciding what I'm asking for instead of hearing what I'm saying. That did it. The audience erupted, applause, whistles, a few shouted yes, that slipped past the studio's usual decorum. The energy had tipped. This was no longer evenly matched. It was charged. Joy blinked, then laughed, shaking her head. Wow, you came ready. I came honest, Jude replied. Whoopi finally stepped in. All right, she said, palms out. Let's not turn this into a boxing match. But even as she spoke, the tension refused to dissolve. It had taken on a life of its own. Joy wasn't finished. She couldn't be. One last thing, she said quickly, before the segment could move on. Do you think men in Hollywood are being unfairly criticized right now? Jude paused. This time, the pause was heavy. He could feel the eyes on him, not just in the room, but beyond it. Millions watching live. Millions more who would see clipped fragments, stripped of nuance. I think power deserves scrutiny, he said slowly. I also think generalization is lazy. Both things can be true. Joy opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time, she seemed unsure where to go next. The applause came again, sustained and unmistakable. Jude leaned back slightly, as if the physical act might release some of the pressure in his chest. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't insulted anyone. But he had refused to bend. And that refusal, quiet, controlled, had landed harder than any outburst. As the camera pulled back and Whoopi transitioned awkwardly toward a commercial break, the audience buzzed with whispered reactions. Some nodded in approval. Others shook their heads, conflicted. Everyone knew they had just seen something real. And as Jude took a sip from his mug, his hand trembling just enough to betray the calm exterior, one truth settled heavily in the room. This conversation wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Because when they came back from break, the politeness would remain. But the gloves were already off. The red light above the camera blinked back on, and with it came a different energy. Not louder, not more chaotic, just heavier. The kind of weight that settles when everyone knows the moment has already escaped the room and is racing through social media in real time. Jude Law adjusted slightly in his chair as the audience applause died down. His face had returned to its neutral calm, but something had changed. The softness was gone. In its place was focus, controlled, deliberate, unyielding. Joy Behar noticed it immediately. So, she said, her tone lighter than before, almost casual. Before the break, we were talking about criticism and power. Jude nodded. Yes. Joy smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I want to clarify something. When people critique men in Hollywood, they're not talking about you personally. They're talking about systems. Jude held her gaze. I understand that distinction intellectually, he said. In practice, it's often blurred. Sonny Hostin chimed in. But don't you think calling that out sometimes centers your feelings instead of the people harmed by those systems? There it was again, the quiet framing. Jude leaned forward, elbows resting lightly on the table. I think, he replied, that conversation collapses when empathy is rationed, when only certain feelings are allowed to exist. The audience murmured. A woman in the second row nodded vigorously. Another crossed her arms. Joy tapped her pen against the table. Empathy isn't infinite, Jude. Attention isn't infinite. When someone with your privilege asks for space in the conversation, it can feel like taking it away from others. Jude didn't interrupt. He let her finish. Then, calmly, I'm not asking for space. I'm asking for accuracy. The applause was instant. Joy sighed. Accuracy according to whom? According to reality, Jude replied, his voice firmer now. Not caricature. A hush fell again. Even Whoopi leaned back, watching closely. Joy folded her hands. Some would say your reality has protected you. Jude nodded once. Undeniably. The admission landed unexpectedly hard. A ripple moved through the audience. Not applause this time, but surprise. But protection, he continued, doesn't disqualify someone from speaking honestly. It obligates them to do so carefully. Joy tilted her head. Carefully or cautiously? Jude smiled faintly. There's a difference. Explain it, Joy said. Caution avoids consequence, Jude said. Care avoids harm. The audience erupted, this time fully. Applause, cheers, even a standing movement from a few seats before studio staff subtly gestured for calm. Joy waited it out, lips pressed together. When she spoke again, her voice had cooled. You're very good with words, she said. But some people watching at home might hear this and think you're dodging responsibility. Jude's expression sharpened. Responsibility for what? For not speaking loudly enough, Joy replied. For not using your influence. Jude leaned back, drawing a slow breath. This was the moment. He felt it. The invisible line where patience either held or snapped. I don't believe volume equals virtue, he said. And I don't believe silence equals guilt. Joy scoffed softly. That's easy to say when silence hasn't cost you anything. The audience gasped. For the first time, Jude's jaw visibly tightened. His politeness didn't vanish, but it crystallized into something harder. You're wrong, he said quietly. Joy blinked. Silence has cost me relationships, Jude continued. It's cost me opportunities. It's cost me peace. You just didn't see it, so it didn't count. The studio went dead quiet. Even the cameras seemed to hold their breath. Joy opened her mouth, then closed it again. Sunny looked between them, eyes wide. Whoopi's expression softened, sensing the shift from debate to something personal. I didn't mean, Joy began. I know, Jude said gently. But that's the problem. Assumption replaces listening. The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They cut cleanly, precisely. A woman in the audience wiped at her eye. A man shook his head slowly, impressed despite himself. Joy straightened in her chair, regaining composure. Do you think, she asked, more measured now, that your tone tonight might come across as defensive? Jude didn't hesitate. I think defending nuance is necessary when it's under attack. Another wave of applause surged, stronger than any before. Joy glanced down at her notes, then back up. You seem frustrated. I am, Jude admitted. Not with you. With the idea that civility is weakness. That landed. Whoopi nodded slowly. That's fair, she said quietly. Joy leaned back, crossing her arms. The energy had shifted again, but this time, not in her favor. Let me ask you something directly, she said. Do you feel misunderstood by the media? Jude considered. I feel simplified, he replied. Flattened into a symbol instead of treated as a person. Joy's voice softened despite herself. That comes with fame. Yes, Jude said. But it shouldn't erase humanity. Silence followed. Not awkward. Reflective. The audience didn't clap this time. They sat with it. The producer's countdown flashed on a monitor. 30 seconds. Joy glanced toward Whoopi, then back at Jude. I don't agree with everything you've said, she admitted. But I appreciate that you said it calmly. Jude nodded. I appreciate being allowed to finish a sentence. A few laughs broke the tension. Even Joy smiled, this time genuinely. But the damage, or the moment, depending on who you asked, had already been done. As the cameras pulled back and the segment wrapped, Jude felt the delayed rush of adrenaline hit. His heart thudded in his chest, louder now that the room had quieted. He knew what was coming next. Clips. Headlines. Tweets stripped of context. Praise. Backlash. And when he finally stood to shake hands, the audience rose in applause. Not the polite kind, but the kind reserved for moments that feel like turning points. This wasn't just a tense interview anymore. It was a statement. And outside the studio walls, the reaction was already igniting. The moment the cameras cut, the applause didn't stop. It swelled, raw and unfiltered now, no longer guided by cues or countdowns. Some audience members stood fully, clapping above their heads. Others remained seated, arms crossed, faces conflicted. But no one looked bored. No one looked indifferent. Jude Law rose slowly from his chair, smoothing his jacket, offering polite nods to the hosts. Up close, the composure showed cracks, his eyes slightly glassed, his breath measured with care. He shook Whoopi's hand first. She squeezed back, leaning in just enough to murmur, You handled that with grace. He turned to Sunny next. She smiled, respectful, contemplative. You gave us a lot to think about, she said. Then Joy. For a half second, it felt like the entire studio leaned in again. Joy stood, meeting Jude's eyes. There was no smile this time, but there was something else, acknowledgement. Thank you for the conversation, she said evenly. Thank you for having it, Jude replied. It was civil. It was contained. But beneath it, something unresolved hummed. Backstage, producers spoke in low, urgent tones. Phones were already out. One assistant whispered, It's trending. Another shook their head, half amused, half alarmed. That line about civility? That's everywhere. By the time Jude reached his dressing room, his publicist was waiting, eyes wide. You're all over X, she said. TikTok too. Multiple angles. Clips were already racing across feeds. Joy's pointed questions, Jude's measured pauses, the quiet intensity of his replies. One caption read, "Jude Law calmly dismantles the View narrative." Another fired back, "Privilege wrapped in poetry." There was no consensus. Only noise. Within an hour, headlines multiplied. Jude Law pushes back on the View. Polite but firm. Actor refuses to play the part. Joy Behar challenges Hollywood comfort. Guest pushes back. Every outlet chose a side, whether it admitted it or not. On social media, the divide was sharper. Supporters praised Jude's restraint, his refusal to raise his voice, his insistence on nuance. "This is how you disagree," one comment read like thousands of times. Calm, respectful, unshakable. Critics weren't gentle. "Another powerful man upset he's being questioned," one post snapped. Silence isn't neutral, it's convenient. Joy Behar broke her silence later that afternoon with a brief statement. "Lively debate is what our table is for," she wrote. "Disagreement isn't disrespect." Jude said nothing. That silence, intentional or not, became its own headline. Late-night hosts referenced the moment. Podcasts dissected it frame by frame. Body language experts slowed the footage, pointing out micro-expressions, pauses, tightened jaws. Commentators argued whether Jude had been defensive or dignified. The clip crossed borders. It reached people who had never watched The View, who didn't care about morning television but recognized something familiar in the exchange. The exhaustion of being talked at, the frustration of being reduced. And somewhere in the middle of all that noise, a quieter reaction emerged. Emails, letters, messages passed through agents and assistants. People thanking him, not for being right, but for being calm. For not shouting. For holding the line without crossing it. Days later, Joy addressed the moment again, this time on air. "I don't regret the questions," she said. "But maybe we all need to listen a little longer before deciding what someone means." The audience applauded. Not wildly. Thoughtfully. Jude never responded publicly. But weeks later, in a separate interview, he was asked about that moment. He paused, just as he had at the table. "I think disagreement doesn't have to be cruel," he said. "And civility doesn't mean surrender." That quote traveled almost as far as the original clip. The moment faded eventually, as all moments do. Another headline replaced it. Another debate took its place. But for those who watched live, or replayed it late at night on glowing screens, it lingered. Not as a victory, not as a loss, but as a reminder that sometimes the most powerful clash isn't loud. It's controlled. And now we want to hear from you. Whose side were you on? Did Jude Law handle the confrontation with strength? Or did Joy Behar ask the questions that needed to be asked? Drop your thoughts in the comments and let the conversation continue. And if you want more explosive cinematic celebrity moments like this, don't forget to subscribe to Stage View, hit like, and share this story with someone who loves the drama behind the headlines.